Some places are meant to be forgotten, but forgetting doesn't always bring peace. From the buried remains, only decaying bones are left behind. But what about memories? What about curses? The old cemetery, just outside Hollow Pine, was a place no one dared to visit. Nestled in the shadow of towering pines, its moss-covered tombstones and rotting earth carried an eerie stillness. Even the wind seemed to avoid rustling the branches. Locals called it the Shadow Graveyard, a name born from whispered tales of a curse. Legend had it that those buried here, victims of an 18th century plague dumped into mass graves, couldn't find peace. Their restless spirits lingered beneath the soil, and at night, faint whispers echoed through the trees, muffled and strange, sometimes calling out a name. The townsfolk warned their kids to steer clear, but Thomas Wren wasn't one to listen. Thomas was a photographer, new to Hollow Pine, fleeing the bustle of city life for the town's quiet charm. When he heard the stories about the Shadow Graveyard, he scoffed. Ghosts? Whispers? Just superstitious nonsense, he said one night at the tavern. I'll go see for myself. If there's anything there, my camera will catch it. The locals pleaded with him to reconsider. An old woman grabbed his arm and rasped, "That ground's alive, it'll swallow you." But Thomas was stubborn. With a flashlight, his old camera, and a notebook in hand, he marched off to the graveyard at midnight. The moon cast a pale glow over the rusted iron gate as he stepped inside. The air turned heavy the moment he entered. Pine needles crunched underfoot, and his flashlight's shaky beam swept across crooked tombstones. Most of the inscriptions were worn away, unreadable. Then moonlight glinted off one stone, revealing a carved warning. Those who lie here are not forgotten. Disturb them and you join them forever. Thomas smirked. Nice touch, he muttered, snapping a photo. When the flash went off, though, the lens caught something. A shadowy figure behind the stone, tall and twisted, there 1 second and gone the next. He froze, swinging his flashlight around, but the spot was empty. Then the ground trembled beneath his feet. Softly at first, rhythmic like a heartbeat. A cold breeze brushed his neck, and whispers rose up. Don't forget. Don't forget. One voice became dozens, overlapping in a haunting murmur. He spun around and saw it. Something moving between the tombstones. It looked human, but wasn't. Its eye sockets were pitch black, its skin gray and moldy, hands caked with mud and bone fragments, like it had clawed its way out of the earth. Thomas opened his mouth to scream, but the thing stared at him. Not with empty eyes, but as if it could see into his soul. He bolted but invisible. Icy hands gripped his ankles. The soil rippled, pulling him down. His camera slipped from his grasp. His flashlight flickered out. In the darkness, the whispers turned into a scream. Don't forget me, he thrashed, clawing at the dirt. But his fingers only found decayed roots and splintered bones. He yelled toward the town's faint lights one last time, but his voice vanished into the night. The next day, with no word from Thomas, the townsfolk grew uneasy. They gathered at the tavern, debating what to do. Maybe he fell, hurt himself, one suggested. We have to check, said another, voice trembling. Finally, a handful of men grabbed flashlights and sticks and headed to the graveyard. Pushing through the rusted gate, they found Thomas's camera half buried in the mud. Its lens shattered, but the film still intact. Venturing deeper, they stumbled upon an open grave in the center of the yard. There lay Thomas, or what was left of him. His skin had been peeled off, not torn by some wild animal, but stripped with deliberate, agonizing precision. His face was frozen in terror, eyes wide, hands scratched raw from digging at the dirt. The surrounding tombstones swayed faintly, though the air was still. The men stumbled back, some retching, others muttering prayers. They couldn't bring themselves to touch the body. Even the police, when called, refused to step foot in the graveyard, saying, "We can't mess with that place." But a few days later, the postmaster brought a shaking hand to the tavern, holding an envelope from an unknown sender. Inside was a single photo, the last shot from Thomas's camera. It showed the tombstone, but now with a new inscription. "Don't forget me either." From that night on, the whispers in the shadow graveyard grew louder, clearer. Some swore they saw a skinless figure standing by the open grave under the full moon, motionless but watching. Thomas's camera was locked away in the town museum, but every full moon, folks claimed a muffled voice drifted from the basement. Don't forget. The townspeople stopped going anywhere near the graveyard, because now the whispers didn't just come at night, they echoed in broad daylight too. We think the dead are silent, yet some still whisper. Who are they calling? Who are they waiting for? Perhaps the answer lies only with those who dare to listen. Do you think the dead can be cursed? And who do you believe killed the photographer? Share your thoughts in the comments. Back in the 1800s, Ashridge Cemetery sat at the highest point of Blackthorn Village, a quiet, gloomy place. The villagers saw it as nothing more than a final resting spot, perched near bean fields, swept by the constant howl of the wind. There were no legends or curses, just old tombstones and weathered soil. But what happened to Edgar Lane etched this ordinary cemetery into the village's memory. Edgar was in his 40s, a quiet, withdrawn gravedigger who'd worked at Ashridge for years. Alongside him was Samuel Holt, a young apprentice in his 20s, curious but timid. Unlike Edgar, Samuel paid attention to the village gossip, though he trusted the older man's cool-headedness. Edgar didn't buy into stories. To him, death was just silence beneath the dirt. That is until one autumn night. That evening, they dug a fresh grave for the blacksmith William's wife. The air was cold, the wind wailing across the hilltop. After lowering the coffin, Edgar started filling in the dirt while Samuel hauled the shovels back to the shed a little ways off. As Edgar drove his spade in for the last time, he heard something. A muffled murmur, like someone trying to speak. He figured it was the wind at first, but as he listened, it turned into a woman's moan. "Help me! Where am I?" Faint but persistent. Edgar paused, frowning. "Samuel, get over here," he called. Samuel hurried back, but when he heard the sound too, his face went pale. That's impossible," he stammered. Against his better judgment, Edgar grabbed his shovel and said, "Let's take a look," digging back into the soil. Samuel helped, though every shovelful made the voice clearer. When they reached the coffin, Edgar pried the wooden lid open with a crowbar. What they saw froze them both. The woman lay there, eyes half open, her mud-streaked face wearing a faint smile. Her lips twitched. She was supposed to be dead, but she didn't look it. Edgar stepped back, and Samuel let out a yelp, tumbling to the ground. "She's dead, Edgar, dead!" he shouted. Just then, the wind rose into a shriek, piercing their ears. The woman shifted, sitting up slightly, her trembling hands gripping the coffin's edges with purpose. She looked at Edgar and rasped, "Don't leave me alone." Her eyes locked onto him, like she was pleading or demanding. Edgar yelled, "Samuel, run!" and bolted toward the shed. Samuel stumbled after him, but Edgar stopped short. "No, it's a trick," he muttered to himself, turning back to face her. Samuel begged, "What are you doing?" But Edgar approached the coffin again. The woman was still there, motionless but wide-eyed. He leaned in, reaching toward the coffin, and then she lunged, grabbing his wrist with a cold, damp hand. It held tight. Edgar screamed and reached for Samuel, but her other hand shot up, clamping onto his chest. Samuel grabbed Edgar's arm, pulling with all his might, but Edgar went limp, eyes wide open, breath gone. Samuel couldn't save him. He screamed and ran to the shed, locking himself inside until dawn. At first light, he raced to the village and fetched the police. When the officers and a few villagers reached Ashridge Cemetery, they found Edgar inside the coffin. Beside the woman, his face locked in terror, eyes staring. Her body was still there too, dead as it should be, but her hands gripped his chest and wrist, like she'd refused to let go. The grave was still open, the shovel lying nearby, and the wind from the bean fields had started dusting dirt back over them. Samuel told the police everything. Edgar opened the coffin, and she was like she was alive. She called to us, then grabbed him. I ran, but Edgar, he didn't make it. The sheriff frowned, muttering, "Windy night, exhaustion, maybe a hallucination." The village doctor confirmed Edgar died of heart failure. Fear or shock, he said, but couldn't explain the bruises on Edgar's wrist and chest. "Looks like something squeezed him," he mumbled. Samuel quit grave digging after that, but he never stopped telling the story. The villagers started to believe something strange hung over Ashridge. Not a curse, but something unexplainable. On windy nights, they said you could hear a woman's voice in the hilltops howl, faint but stubborn. Some stories aren't just told, they're felt. The graves we think are silent sometimes whisper, and sometimes they call someone to join them. Paranormal never ends in Joseph City. If you want more dark tales, make sure to subscribe and like the video.